Okay, so ancient Romans and ancient history. What do you think they made of their ancient history? And the reason I say that is because it's easy sometimes to consider ancient Rome as this homogenous block. But the reality was that if you have a Roman in the first century AD, they were at that time modern, in the same way that I am modern or trying to feel modern in 2025. But we do get an idea of the Romans understanding ancient history, or rather the older history that they were associated to, through a couple of sources and through some festivals. Festivals, by the way, are a fascinating way of understanding ancient Rome, and in fact, any culture, simply because they tell us a lot about what the cultural values they are. It gives us these weird and unique insights into how people understood themselves, and as I said, within Rome, how they understood the Roman culture and Roman history. Hint, Romans don't seem to have known a lot about their history, but I'll get to that in a moment. Two writers in the first century AD give what I think are really interesting insights into what the Romans thought of old, and in particular, old objects. Martial wrote a list of possible present options, and amongst those was an antique vase as an option. Pliny, in one of his letters, wrote about buying a statue, a very old statue, and he was sending it to Como, which was his hometown. He added that he was a bit worried because he didn't know if it was genuine or not. And that itself, I think, is very, very fun because there was obviously a bunch of people running around the first century AD with knockoff jobs. This isn't really genuine, but I'm going to sell it as something. Perhaps I left it in the garden to age, or I did something to make it look a bit older than it actually was. Then there were festivals and the like. And one festival that I certainly like, in fact, this might be my favorite current Roman festival, trust me, these do change daily, was the Anna Perenna, which was celebrated in March. Now, it might sound like a long book written by a Russian author, but in fact, it was very different. It was a day in which the plebs of Rome, such as myself, would have left the city and camped nearby, building themselves temporary shelters and getting very drunk. In fact, drinking was the main part of it. The poet Ovid talks with disgust about how drunk people were getting, particularly women, how very dare they get drunk as well. Now, if you'd wandered around and found someone sober enough to discuss this with, you'd ask them, well, why are you doing this? And the chances are you'd get different responses, assuming you could find more than one sober person. It might have been because it was the spring, and that's given by some of the sources. The whole spring coming in makes sense. It was celebrated in March after all. But also there were links to Dido, the Carthaginian queen, her sister. She's cited as a possible rationale. And also a woman who helped the plebs during a political crisis in the 5th century BC. And finally, a somewhat sinister procession. So you had the procession involving the Argi. These were straw dolls, and the procession would go through Rome. It was led by the Flaminica Dialis, the priestess of Jupiter. It involved the Vestal Virgins. And when they arrived at the bridge, the Pons Sublicius in Rome, they would throw these straw dolls into the river. All the sources seem to think that this was substitute sacrifice. These once had represented people, but obviously the Romans, being civilized, had moved on from that. But exactly how they got to that point was debated. No one exactly knew. Some thought it was Hercules, who apparently traveled through the area and civilized everyone. This was before Rome, by the way. This was before Rome had been founded. But the point being is that no one really understood why this was happening, but it was still a huge draw. It was a very, very important event. And in fact, much of what was going on there wasn't fully understood by the sources that we have, or rather was debated. And I do wonder if there were some discussions going on, shall we say, in the pubs of Rome or at the drinking tables of Rome, where people were trying to argue why that was the case. Why was this still being done? But it was still done. That was the important thing. So for ancient Rome then, it had a lot of history, but it wasn't always understood history. For them, it was ancient history, but it still had a lot of meaning. And I'm still going to be thinking about that whole Anna Perenna thing. Can we do that now? I think we could. Anyway, hope you found that interesting.